Serious, what is the downright scariest thing that has ever happened to you, be it paranormal or otherwise? At 16, I found myself wandering the local mall alone, shadowed by an unsettling feeling that quickly sharpened into genuine fear. A large man seemed to be mirroring my every move. Wherever I turned, there he was. After 15 minutes of this silent pursuit, I ducked into a Starbucks, hoping the crowd would deter him. He followed me inside anyway. Panicked and thinking irrationally, I spotted the public restrooms nearby and decided to duck into the women's room, naively assuming he wouldn't dare enter. I rushed into a stall, bolted the lock, and immediately pulled my feet up onto the seat to hide my presence, since the door didn't reach the floor. Less than 10 seconds later, the heavy outer door swung open. Heavy footsteps entered and stopped directly in front of my stall. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, facing the door so closely that the toes of his boots actually protruded underneath the partition into my space. We sat in a terrifying, suffocating silence. Then, as abruptly as he had arrived, he turned and walked out. I never saw him again, but the memory of those few minutes, and the anger I feel toward myself for choosing to isolate myself in that bathroom, has never left me. When I was 5 or 6 years old living in Dallas, I was sitting in the nurse's office when the tornado sirens began their haunting wail. In the ensuing panic, the nurse rushed toward the other side of the building, inadvertently leaving me behind. The power cut out, plunging the school into darkness. Terrified of being alone, I tried to follow her and found myself on a ramp that connected the two wings of the school. To my right was the cafeteria, to my left, a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the sky was so black I could see nothing, but the roar of the wind and the piercing scream of the sirens overwhelmed me. Paralyzed by fear, I stood there sobbing in the dark for what felt like an eternity. Suddenly, the vice principal came sprinting up the ramp. She scooped me into her arms, asking whose class I belonged to as she carried me to safety. I still remember the relief of entering the classroom and seeing my teacher, Ms. May, holding a flashlight and huddling with my classmates in the center of the room. 16 years have passed, and Ms. May remains my hero. Three or 4 years ago, my friend and I were driving through a remote, rural area in the middle of the night. The roads were pitch black. As we approached an intersection, my friend tried to get my attention. I made the mistake of turning my head to look at her without slowing down, assuming the desolate roads were empty. The next moment was pure terror. As we crossed the intersection, I saw a pickup truck barreling straight toward us through her side window. The driver slammed on his brakes and held down the horn, but the collision was unavoidable. The memory of the impact is a blur of noise and screaming. I regained consciousness briefly on the side of the road, consumed by an all-encompassing pain that made it impossible to move. Later, I drifted in and out of awareness in a hospital bed. Once I was fully stable a few days later, 2 friends and a nurse entered my room. One of them broke down as they delivered the news. The friend who had been in the car with me didn't survive the crash. I was left with a broken arm, a broken leg, a concussion, and a crushing weight of guilt that didn't fully set in until I was discharged. Back at my apartment, I spent days in a state of deep depression, barely moving from the TV or the window. My roommate stayed close, bringing me food and keeping a watchful eye on me. Though they feared I might harm myself, my mind was simply stuck in a loop of self-blame. I was convinced I was responsible for her death. Eventually, my roommates returned home with a visitor, the driver of the truck. He collapsed into tears the moment he saw me, begging for my forgiveness. As we talked, I realized he was carrying the same heavy burden of guilt that I was. He began visiting for an hour every day, and we talked about everything, not just the accident. Those conversations became a vital part of my healing process. A week later, I finally felt strong enough to leave my apartment for the first time. I haven't seen him since those visits ended, but I truly hope he has been able to find peace with what happened. I was on a flight from Denver to New York City when, roughly 30 seconds after takeoff, the left engine suddenly exploded. The crew later mentioned it was likely a bird strike. Initially, I remained relatively calm, but my composure broke when I realized the flight attendants were all crying. The fear intensified as we returned for an emergency landing. Looking out the window, I saw fire trucks lined up the entire length of the runway. To make matters worse, we were directed to a strip located as far away from the terminal and other aircraft as possible. It was a harrowing experience that I wouldn't wish on anyone. However, that day taught me an important lesson. If you ever go through something like that, you have to get on the next available flight. Some of the other passengers chose to take the train home instead, but I am certain that if I hadn't forced myself back into the air immediately, I would have been too terrified to ever fly again. This is happening right now. Living in Northern California, I wasn't far from the Rocky and Jerusalem fires while they were active, but now a new fire has erupted, one that is arguably worse and significantly closer to home. During the day, the air is thick with smoke, and at night, the horizon glows with an ominous light, as if Mordor is sitting just over the mountain. I am gripped by the fear that my family will lose the house I've lived in my entire life, and I'm terrified for my friends and their homes as well. I'm just really scared. When I was 16, I was watching The Exorcist when my grandmother returned home and told me to turn it off. She explained that it was the last movie my grandfather had watched on the night he passed away. About 20 minutes later, I saw him sitting in the rocking chair right next to my couch. No matter how many times I pulled the blanket over my head in terror, he remained there. He didn't disappear until he finally looked at me, smiled, and then vanished into thin air. Even though that was 18 years ago, I still can't watch that movie to this day without completely freaking out. Back in high school, 2 of my friends were spending the night at my parents' house. My bedroom was situated just a hallway and a pantry away from the kitchen. At one point, I heard the back door handle jiggle, a sound that usually meant one of the cats wanted to go out, so I got up to let the cat out and grab a drink. When I reached the kitchen, there was no cat in sight. However, I noticed the basement door was standing wide open, despite the fact that we always kept it closed and locked. Feeling a bit unnerved, I shut and locked it. Directly next to that door was a staircase leading to the second floor, which was notoriously loud and creaky. A couple of hours later, I heard the distinct sound of the refrigerator door closing. It struck me as odd because I hadn't heard it open, nor had I heard anyone walk past my room or down those noisy back stairs. Growing increasingly uneasy, I grabbed a knife and headed into the kitchen. The room was empty, but I immediately noticed smoke curling up from under the basement door. When I opened it, the space was thick with smoke. I quickly shut the door and woke my parents. We called the fire department and prepared to spend the rest of the night in the car. It was about 4 a.m. by then. Eventually, a firefighter informed us it was safe to return inside. He explained that the furnace had caught fire, filling the house with carbon monoxide. If my friends and I had gone to sleep, we likely wouldn't have survived. To this day, I have no explanation for what jiggled the doorknob or closed the fridge, but those phantom sounds are the reason I'm still alive. When I was 9 years old, I was kidnapped while walking to a friend's house just 6 doors down from my own. It was a short distance, and my mom expected me back for dinner at 6 p.m. As I walked, I noticed a man in a car trailing me, an experience that still causes me anxiety whenever I walk near traffic today. I picked up my pace, counting down the houses until I reached safety. 3, 2. But then he stopped, jumped out, and grabbed me. It happened faster than I can describe. Fortunately, my friend's father was sitting on his porch and witnessed the abduction. He immediately sprinted after the car as it sped away. Inside, the man held me down on his lap with one hand while covering my mouth with the other, repeatedly shouting at me to shut up as I screamed. My friend's father managed to keep pace with the vehicle for about 10 blocks. Gasping for breath and clinging to the side mirror, he tried desperately to pull the door open. Realizing he couldn't get in, he punched straight through the window and used his bloodied hand to pull me out of the car. He carried me all the way back to my house, where I stood shaking and crying as he explained the situation to my mother. Though she reported the kidnapping to the police, the man was never identified, and the trauma of those minutes has stayed with me ever since. During my time as a firefighter, we were dispatched one early summer evening to a large gas station. This wasn't a typical corner station. It was a substantial complex housing a restaurant, a shop, and rental rooms on the second floor. My best friend and I had been battling a significant blaze inside the structure for about an hour, both of us already on our third air bottles. We were deep inside and making solid progress when the truck's air horn suddenly blasted 3 long signals, the emergency evacuation order. Our fire chief's voice came over the radio, frantically demanding an immediate exit. Usually, this means the building's structural integrity is failing, and while the fire didn't seem that dire from our vantage point, we trusted the call and began retreating toward the exit. What we didn't know was that minutes earlier, the business owner had arrived and asked if his fireworks could be saved. With the 4th of July only 3 weeks away, he had just stocked a storeroom with an entire semi-truck's worth of explosives. The chief realized that thousands of pounds of gunpowder were sitting in a burning building filled with his crew. Just as my friend and I rounded a corner to leave, the fire reached that back storeroom. For anyone who hasn't been 10 feet away from a massive fireworks display, I can tell you it is far more intense than seeing it from the ground. It was deafening and blinding. Vibrant colors and explosive pops surrounded us instantly. Disoriented and terrified, we grabbed onto each other, trying to find a way out. To make matters worse, the restaurant kitchen floor had become a nightmare slip and slide. Years of accumulated grease had been heated by the fire and coated with water from our hoses, making every step a struggle. Fortunately, only a small portion of the inventory ignited while we were still inside, or I likely wouldn't be here to tell this. Once we cleared the building, we set up deck guns and aerial deluges for a surround and drown operation, watching the rest of the fireworks show from a safe distance. That experience, along with the time I was trapped in a ring of fire during a woods blaze when the flames crowned over our heads, remain the most terrifying moments of my career, but the fireworks story is certainly the most vivid. Years ago, while visiting my parents, I took my friendly lab mix out for a walk around 5 a.m. My dog was the type who had never met a stranger, and even at 10 months old, she was a happy, stumpy little thing. Near the end of our very long driveway, I encountered a man standing among the pine trees. He asked if I had a cigarette. When I told him I didn't, he simply wished me a good night. Throughout the brief exchange, my dog was straining at her leash, desperate to get to him for some attention. I turned and made it halfway back up the driveway when, without warning, she lunged behind me. The force nearly ripped my shoulder out of its socket as she went absolutely ballistic, a level of aggression I have never seen from her again in the 8 years since. When I spun around to restrain her, I saw the man just inches beyond her reach, sprinting away in the opposite direction. He had been silently following me up the drive. Later, I remembered my family mentioning a lingering smell of cigarette smoke around the front porch and garage during my stay. It realized then that he had likely been lurking around the house for days. I hate to think about what might have happened if my dog hadn't suddenly sensed his presence and flipped her lid. When I was around 11 or 12, I went on a Girl Scout trip and stayed in an old house in Sandy Hook. One night, while everyone was in bed, I felt an inexplicable urge to go downstairs. I remember clearly hearing the muffled voices of the adults talking in the kitchen and seeing a room glowing with light ahead of me, so I began walking toward it. Suddenly, the scene vanished. I found myself standing in the center of a dark, dilapidated room filled with plaster dust and random debris, completely devoid of furniture. Panicked, I tried to retrace my steps to find the adults, wandering through the shadows until I finally stumbled upon a staircase. It was then that I noticed something bizarre. The bottom of the stairs was completely blocked by a heavy couch. The realization hit me all at once. I had been sleepwalking and had somehow navigated past the barricade to reach the restricted third floor, a place we had been strictly forbidden to enter. One night in Chicago, after finishing a shift chaperoning a debate team trip, I was walking back to my car when I realized a man in a vehicle was following me. He passed me once, then circled back and passed again. At first, I wonder if he had mistaken me for a sex worker and remember thinking he'd be disappointed if he actually stopped to talk to me. However, the situation quickly turned predatory. He began idling along at my walking speed, only pulling away when another car approached. I crossed the street and crouched behind a parked vehicle to hide. When I stood back up, he was nowhere in sight. I continued walking, but as I reached the next intersection, I saw him waiting, tucked away on a side street. He was still trailing me as I neared my car, so I approached a group of teenage girls and blurted out, "I think that man is following me." Unfazed, the man actually parked directly behind my car, waiting for me to be alone again. Thankfully, the girls stayed with me and walked me all the way to my door. They even texted me his license plate number, but I don't think I've ever felt more unsafe in my entire life. I've mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. One night, I suffered what was later described as a severe anxiety attack. I woke up unable to breathe and rolled over to wake my girlfriend for help. In that moment, I saw her mangled, her head nearly severed from her body. I wanted to scream, but I was paralyzed, lying there staring at her in total horror. My only thought was the crushing guilt that I hadn't been able to stop whatever had done this to her. As it turns out, I was experiencing a localized episode of psychosis that lasted about 12 hours and included other visual hallucinations. My therapist explained it was likely triggered by the intensity of the panic attack acting on my existing PTSD. Thankfully, my girlfriend was perfectly fine. She was fast asleep, and as soon as I reached out to touch her, the horrific image vanished. Even after 4 deployments, that remains the most haunting thing I have ever seen. Since then, through a combination of therapy and medication, the panic attacks have subsided. I haven't had one in about a month now. After our son was born, we experienced several incidents where his toys would spontaneously activate and make noise while we were all downstairs. On one occasion, a toy even went off in the middle of the night right in our master bedroom. While the logical explanation is that the electronics were simply malfunctioning due to dying batteries or a switch stuck between settings, it was still incredibly unsettling at the time. I woke up one morning to find my eyes feeling impossibly dry, a sensation beyond description. Even though my alarm was blaring, signifying it was at least 8 a.m. and the room should be bright, everything was pitch black. I couldn't see a single thing. I actually had to feel my eyelids with my fingers just to confirm they were actually open. I quickly shut them and spent about a minute rubbing them and letting my eyes tear up to restore some moisture. Finally, my vision returned. I can tell you from experience, waking up completely blind is not a fun way to start the day. One night, while I was asleep, a fire broke out in the hallway just outside my bedroom. My mom had recently become obsessed with home security and, without telling me, had placed a wooden dowel in my window track as a DIY lock since our old house lacked proper window latches. I woke up to smoke curling under my bedroom door. Terrified and acting on instinct, I tried to escape through the window, but I couldn't get the dowel out. I spent what felt like 10 minutes desperately clawing at the wood with my small fingers, unable to budge it from the seal. Finally, my mom burst into the room. She wrapped me in a wet towel and supermommed me out of the house to safety. But she didn't stop there. She actually went back inside, grabbed the fire extinguisher from under the kitchen sink, and put the fire out herself. Fortunately, it didn't turn into a catastrophe, but I'll never forget that feeling of being trapped by a simple piece of wood. My fiancé and I live out in the sticks. About a month ago, during a power outage following a storm, we were lying in bed just talking and watching the clouds roll out. Suddenly, I broke out in goosebumps, and every hair on my body stood on end. A humming noise began to fill the air, steadily rising in frequency and volume. Outside, the neighbor's dogs started growling and whining. We had the window open and the curtains pulled back, something we rarely do because of a neighbor's bright security light, but since the power was out, the yard and the surrounding fields were pitch black under the stars. I asked him, "Do you feel that?" At the exact moment he said, "Something's coming." The buzzing abruptly cut out, replaced by a flash of white light so brilliant it dazzled my eyes for the next hour. It lit up the backyard and the landscape for a mile around. It reminded me of a close lightning strike, except the intensity surged upward and then slowly dimmed, like someone turning a dimmer switch to the maximum setting and then back down. It was so bright that I could see a neighbor's combine over a mile away in their house, which usually isn't even visible during an overcast day. My internal alarm went off. I couldn't understand why I could suddenly see the pattern on their curtains or why the dogs sounded like they were in physical pain. I looked at my fiancée, who was squinting at the sky. I looked up too, but it was like staring into a dentist's lamp. I couldn't make out anything. The brightness eventually began to fade, shifting from washed-out white to a dim yellow, then an ochre hue, before returning to total darkness. It stayed black for about 5 seconds until a second flash hit. This one massive and near instantaneous, with no gradual dimming. From the moment the goosebumps started to the final flash, the entire event lasted about 60 to 70 seconds. It was much longer than lightning and lacked the typical flickering of a strike. Neither of us has a logical explanation, and most people just think the story is crazy. However, just last night, my daughter and I saw hovering lights out in the field. We investigated the area today and found nothing unusual, but if this continues, we're going to start recording the sky every night. We had a baby monitor that didn't just transmit sound. It monitored our son's breathing and was designed to trigger an alarm to prevent SIDS. If it detected a lapse, an alarm would go off in the nursery to jar the baby and simultaneously alert us via a remote. One night, we forgot to turn the volume up, and I woke up in the middle of the night to see the alert lights pegged at maximum. I bolted out of bed, screaming for my wife, and charged into the nursery. My heart dropped when I looked into the crib and found it completely empty. Thinking my wife must have brought the baby into our bed and simply forgotten to switch off the monitor, I spun around as she ran into the room. "He's in our bed," I shouted. She screamed in absolute terror because she knew for a fact he wasn't. The world seemed to stop as she shrieked, "Who took my baby?" Through a massive surge of adrenaline and sheer fright, I forced myself to think logically. The house alarm was still armed, the windows were secure, and the nursery door had been closed. He had to be in the room. I scanned the floor and realized the only possible hiding spot was beneath the crib. I dropped to my hands and knees, and there he was, lying on his belly, smiling up at me while his mother was hysterical. I reached under and gently pulled him out by his ankles. When my wife saw me pulling him from under the furniture, she briefly feared the worst. We couldn't fathom how a 1-year-old who couldn't even stand yet had managed to scale a high-sided crib and survive a 4-foot drop completely unharmed. She scooped him up and rocked him, crying for an hour. I didn't sleep a wink that night, and that little monster has kept us on our toes ever since. One night, I was carpooling with a friend to work, taking a rarely used back road that served as a shortcut. It was about 10 p.m., and we were completely alone on this old, unlit stretch of pavement, with nothing but our headlights cutting through the dark. After about 15 minutes of driving, we came upon a stop sign in the middle of nowhere. My friend, an incredibly cautious driver, brought the car to a meticulous, full stop. As we sat there, I looked out the window and saw a woman standing on the corner. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, dressed in what looked like a white coat and matching pants. Because of the poor lighting, I couldn't make out her facial features, but the sheer oddity of someone standing in the middle of nowhere at night struck me immediately. I turned to my friend and asked if we should see if she needed a ride. My friend just looked at me and stammered, "She?" "Come on," I replied. "You can't tell me that's a man." A heavy silence fell over the car. My friend looked me dead in the eye and told me she had absolutely no clue what I was talking about. Thinking she was joking, I insisted, You can't be serious. I'm talking about that woman right over there. I turned my gaze back to the corner, but there was no one there. The woman had vanished. A sinking feeling hit the pit of my stomach, and panic set in. I knew what I had seen. "Go," I yelled. "Let's get out of here." We took off like a bat out of hell. I refused to look in the rearview mirror and kept my eyes squeezed shut for the rest of the trip. We didn't say another word the whole way. The following week, I shared the story with a coworker. He turned pale and told me that several years prior, a woman had been brutally murdered in that exact area. She was a nurse who had been attacked late at night while commuting to or from work. As he spoke, the chills intensified. The white outfit I'd seen was a perfect match for medical scrubs. To this day, I refuse to drive down that back road, day or night. And if I ever absolutely had to, I can guarantee you I'm running that stop sign. Back in May, I went hiking with my roommate and a group of his friends. We eventually reached a scenic overlook at the summit, defined by a sheer 150-foot cliff. After spending a few minutes taking photos, we began moving toward a side trail. We hadn't gone far when I heard the most haunting, terrified scream. I raced back to the overlook and found a middle-aged man sitting near the edge, his face a mask of pure devastation. A woman nearby told me the unthinkable: his wife had just fallen. I ran to the edge and looked down. She was lying face down on the rocks below. While I scanned for a path down, several others, including my roommate, managed to scramble down to her. The scene below was gruesome. She was unconscious, her body shattered by the impact. Her ribs and pelvis were crushed, and one leg was twisted at a glass-shattering angle. Despite the trauma, those beside her felt a faint pulse and heard a gurgling sound, leading us to hope she was still alive. A psychologist at the top began shouting down instructions, telling them to recite familiar names: her husband, her children, her dogs, hoping for any sign of a response. There was none. I later learned that the gurgling was actually a sign of brain death. She had likely died the moment she hit the ground, though her body systems flickered for a few minutes longer. The people with her stayed silent about this to avoid further traumatizing the husband, who was in the throes of a massive panic attack. I overheard a woman comforting him, saying, "It isn't your fault." At the time, I assumed she was addressing his general guilt for planning the hike. Only later did I learn the horrific truth. As she was taking a picture at the edge, he had tripped and bumped into her, accidentally sending her over. It took paramedics about 15 minutes to reach the mountain, but because she had fallen into a pathless area of thick forest, it took them another 30 minutes to actually reach her side. The moment they arrived, they took one look at her injuries and immediately covered her with a tarp. That night, our group had dinner together to process the day. Those who had gone down to her described the injuries, and others recounted seeing the actual fall. Yet, we all agreed that the most traumatic part wasn't the visual horror, it was the sound. The husband's screams lasted for hours. Listening to the raw agony of a man who had just lost the mother of his 3 daughters was more haunting than anything else. Because most of the group attended the same high school, the administration found out and arranged for them to meet with grief counselors. Most of us eventually recovered, though one girl required long-term therapy to cope with what she saw. We are all okay now, but the memory still gives me chills. I can safely say I will never stand near the edge of a cliff again for as long as I live. About 10 years ago, 3 friends and I were hanging out late one night in a car parked on a dark residential street. I had chosen this specific spot because my grandmother lived nearby, and I was intimately familiar with the neighborhood. I knew most of the families on the block, mainly elderly people who kept to themselves. When we pulled up, I noted that all the house lights were off. I figured we could park there as long as we wanted without being disturbed. I had the driver park on the corner in front of a house belonging to a longtime friend of my grandmother. She was an older woman who lived alone and always went to bed early. Her house sat on a medium-sized lot atop a small but remarkably steep hill, the kind of incline that was a nightmare to mow. I was sitting in the back behind the passenger seat. The car was still idling, and we had only been there for 2 or 3 minutes, just starting our activities, when I caught a glimpse of movement in the passenger side mirror. I looked out the window, and what I saw terrified me then and haunts me to this day. I saw the silhouette of a person lying on their stomach, performing a high-speed army crawl along the side of that steep hill, heading straight for our car. This thing was moving incredibly fast. I honestly don't know how it's physically possible to crawl with that much speed on flat ground, let alone moving parallel across a steep incline. Panic seized me, and I screamed at the driver, "Go, go, go, now, get out of here." The figure had covered a massive amount of ground in seconds and was within 5 or 6 feet of my door when we peeled out of there. As we reached the main road, the driver and my friend next to me started shouting, asking if I'd seen the cops. I was so badly shaken I couldn't even speak. My brain was struggling to process what I had just witnessed. I looked at my friend, P, in the front passenger seat. He had a look of absolute, stone-cold terror on his face. I blurted out, "You saw it too, didn't you?" He didn't answer at first. He just kept staring into the side mirror and then back at the dashboard. My other 2 friends were getting frustrated and angry, demanding to know what was going on. Finally, I told them I'd seen someone or something crawling toward the car at an impossible speed. I asked P to back me up. All he did was nod silently before asking to be dropped off at home immediately. He refused to describe what he saw, only whispering that he had seen something. At the time, that was enough for me. I was just relieved I wasn't the only one who had seen it. To this day, I have no idea who or what that was. For years afterward, I hated going to my grandmother's house at night, and I never felt comfortable around her friend again. The thought of a woman in her 60s army crawling across a hill at 1 a.m. is almost scarier than any other explanation. It still gives me the chills just thinking about it. As I drove through my burning town, the reality of the nightmare set in. I was forced to abandon my planned evacuation route when a massive, flaming branch crashed down, blocking the road and trapping me. With no other choice, I turned the car around and began a desperate journey through the heart of the town. It looked as though a bomb had been dropped. Ash rained down like snow, and walls of fire lined both sides of the street as homes and businesses were consumed. I navigated through a landscape of melted cars, down power lines, and the mangled wreckage of accidents. My only thought, the one thing keeping me moving, was getting home to my family to ensure they were safe. The lack of cell service only intensified the terror. I was driving through an apocalypse in total isolation. I passed fire engines and police cruisers racing toward the destruction I was fleeing. In those moments, I didn't believe I would make it to the other side. I was certain my fate would match that of the scorched, abandoned vehicles I was passing. I actually have a video that captured part of my reaction to what I saw. After taking a few photos, I had tossed my phone onto the seat, not realizing it had started recording. The footage ends abruptly as I react to the sight of an entire neighborhood engulfed in a single sheet of flame. Watching it was so chilling that I've only seen it once, just long enough to edit out the silences and upload it. I hope it conveys even a fraction of the sheer terror I felt in those moments. It was around 10:30 p.m., and I was relaxing on the couch, lost in my earbuds and messing around on my iPad. I remember closing my eyes while listening to Lithium by Nirvana, only to notice the music suddenly cut out. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't on my couch anymore. I was standing outside in a cul-de-sac at the far end of my neighborhood, about half a mile from my house. I was wearing nothing but my pajama bottoms in sub-freezing temperatures, staring blankly into a dark cornfield. Shivering, I made the long walk back home. When I finally reached my room, I realized it was 3 a.m. I had no idea how I'd spent those missing hours, but I discovered I had scribbled nonsensically in my school notebooks and somehow managed to extinguish the fireplace during my nighttime adventure. I tried to convince myself the whole thing had been a vivid nightmare until the next morning. My mom asked me why I had shaken so much dried grass off my pajama pants onto the living room floor. Realizing I had actually been out there, completely unconscious of my actions, freaked me out pretty badly. I was snorkeling with some friends off the eastern coast of Nicaragua when I spotted a shark on the ocean floor, seemingly minding its own business. Excited, I surfaced to yell to my friends that there was a shark right below us. Suddenly, I noticed the shark beginning to rise toward me. At first, I thought it was an incredible sight, until I realized it was swimming directly at me with intent. That's when the awe turned to pure panic. I started swimming for my life, thrashing at the surface so hard that I lost a fin and my goggles in the chaos. The shark was only a few feet away when I finally reached the boat and hurled myself onto the deck in a desperate scramble for safety. I looked up, expecting horror, only to find the local Nicaraguan guides and my friends doubled over in hysterical laughter. As it turned out, the shark was actually caught on one of their fishing lines. The guide had been slowly winching it to the surface just to give us a better view. I'm not usually someone who gets rattled, but in that moment, I was absolutely certain I was done for. It was, without question, the scariest experience of my life. I saw something truly unsettling. You know that feeling when you think you see a person out of the corner of your eye, only for them to vanish the moment you turn your head? This wasn't that. I was sitting on the couch, half watching Netflix and browsing Reddit, when I noticed a head peeking out from the stairwell. Usually, these things disappear when you acknowledge them, but when I looked directly at it, it remained. It stayed there for a long moment before slowly, deliberately pulling its head back behind the wall. I saw it clearly enough to notice that the skin looked charred and severely burned. What creeps me out the most isn't just what I saw, but my puppy's reaction. He was sitting right with me and spent the next 5 minutes staring fixedly at that exact spot, his ears perked and the hair on his back standing straight up. One evening, I was hanging out in the jacuzzi with 2 of my friends. It was getting incredibly hot, so I decided to take a quick, impulsive dive into the freezing pool. My plan was to jump right back into the heat, but in my haste, I dove directly onto a concrete step. I blacked out for a second and regained consciousness, unable to move for a few terrifying heartbeats. Finally, I managed to pull myself onto the ledge, leaning over toward the jacuzzi. My back and neck were seizing up, and I couldn't breathe because the impact had completely knocked the wind out of me. I was paralyzed by the fear that I had broken my neck. Even though I could technically move, every muscle was just locked in a tight, agonizing grip. As I leaned over the edge gasping for air, my friends started laughing, thinking I was just playing a prank. They were telling me to shut up and stop being annoying. When I kept gasping, one of them joked, "Gasp one more time, and I'm pushing you back in." I did, and he followed through, shoving me back into the cold water. I scrambled back up, still struggling for air, and he was about to push me in again when I reached up and touched my hair. My hand came away covered in blood. I had cracked my head wide open. Now, you might think the scariest part was the head wound or the near-broken neck. It wasn't. I was actually terrified that my mother was going to be furious at my stupidity. In a moment of genius, I decided the best course of action was to wrap my head in a massive wad of paper towels and wait until morning. I figured waking her up at 1 a.m. would only make her angrier. When she finally woke up, I tried to play it cool, threw away the mountain of blood-soaked paper towels, and sheepishly asked for help. Of course, she immediately saw the evidence in the trash and was livid, not because I was dumb, but because I hadn't woken her up when I was clearly seriously injured. She rushed me to the hospital to get glued and stitched back together. That was a rough night. Though, it's a toss-up for scariest moment between that and the time I was in the car with my dad during an attempted carjacking, and he decided to handle it by beating the absolute hell out of the carjacker. Both were pretty intense. Back when I was 18, I was working as a healthcare assistant at my local hospital while still living at home. Since I was scheduled for an afternoon shift, I was still in bed around 11 a.m. I was lying there wide awake when I heard a sudden noise downstairs. 99 times out of 100, you can dismiss that as the central heating or just your imagination, but this time, the sounds kept coming. The realization hit me. This was real. There were actually people in my house. Paralyzed by indecision, I finally scrambled out of bed and stood frozen in front of my bedroom door, wearing nothing but my boxers. Just then, the door swung open, and I found myself face to face with a complete stranger. We both stood there, locked in a silent stare for what felt like half an hour, though in reality, it was probably about 3 seconds before he turned and noped right out of the house. It wasn't until I saw them sprinting out of my front gate that I realized he'd had an accomplice waiting downstairs. That experience was deeply unsettling, but looking back, it wasn't the scariest moment of my life. That title belongs to a night my girlfriend was walking home alone. She was a bit tipsy and had called me because she was feeling uneasy. It was already a tense conversation, but then she suddenly dropped her phone. Listening to the silence for 20 agonizing seconds while she fumbled to find it in the dark nearly broke me. I don't particularly mind the idea of getting hurt myself, but nothing on this planet compares to the sheer, helpless terror of thinking someone you love is in danger. One day at work, one of the horses managed to get herself tangled in a fence. I was busy trying to calm her down while shouting for the rest of the staff to come help. I was positioned on the opposite side of the fence inside a pen with 2 other horses, while the trap mare was in one of the turnout fields. Suddenly, another horse in the field decided to kick at her. The mare lurched forward, toppling the fence panel directly into me. I went down hard and hit my head with significant force. I remember the sheer terror of lying there, certain she was going to land right on top of me as she scrambled to jump over. She came incredibly close to stepping on me in the chaos. It took me a solid 45 minutes just to stop shaking and get my heart rate back to normal. I used to live in a rental house directly across the street from a bustling city park. Late at night, when the crowds had cleared out, I loved to step out onto my porch to just sit and look at the trees and the stars in the silence. One night, around 1 a.m., I opened my front door and was about to sit down when I froze. There was a man standing in the deserted park, positioned directly in front of my house. He was dressed entirely in black and was wearing a skull mask, the kind that looked intricate from a distance but was clearly a cheap, store-bought version. The sight sent a sharp chill down my spine. He didn't move an inch, even though I knew he'd seen me. The entire neighborhood was dead silent as we both just stood there, holding our ground and watching each other for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, he finally sauntered away into the darkness. Convinced he was casing the neighborhood, I called the police. They came out and took my statement, but nothing ever came of it. Fast forward a couple of months. I was doing some yard work along the side of my house, clearing out a thicket of weeds beneath my kitchen window. I spotted what looked like a piece of trash buried in the dirt and reached down to pick it up. It was the exact same mask from that night. One night, I was coming home particularly late and backed my car into the driveway as I usually do. It was a dark, overcast night, and the porch light had been left off. My house has an old wooden front porch that sits about 3 or 4 feet off the ground, leaving a hollow crawl space underneath. As I climbed the porch stairs, I felt something snag my ankle, causing me to stumble. When I looked down, I realized with a jolt of horror that a hand was firmly gripping my leg. I let out a gasp and kicked back as hard as I possibly could, managed to break the grip, and scrambled the rest of the way to the door. I frantically fumbled with my keys, finally managed to unlock the door, and threw myself inside. Shaken and breathless, I peeked through a small crack in the curtains while I dialed the police. The officers arrived a short while later, but found no one. They mentioned they had never dealt with a report like that in the area and noted that there were no footprints or signs of a disturbance in the dirt beneath the porch. That was a couple of years ago, and I still live in the same house. I try to convince myself it was just a neighborhood kid pulling a prank or maybe a friend trying to scare me, though no one has ever come forward. I'll likely never know for sure what happened that night, but I did make sure to install a motion-activated light on the porch immediately afterward. When I was 18, I worked the graveyard shift at a yacht club. One night, during some downtime, I made the mistake of watching The Exorcist 3. The club was already eerie enough after dark. Empty, poorly lit docks, the constant creaking of boats on their moorings, and fire axes stationed every 50 feet, which made me feel like a potential killer would always have a weapon within arm's reach. I was finishing my rounds, quietly walking the perimeter of the clubhouse and the long stretches of dock, trying to shake off the lingering dread from the movie. I reached a section where several large vessels were moored, which cut my visibility down to almost nothing. As I passed one of the boats, a massive figure that had been silent until that moment suddenly lunged at me, screaming incoherently and moving fast. My survival instinct kicked in with a bizarre choice. I dove headfirst into the water. It was 3 a.m. I was already terrified, and suddenly I was submerged in pitch-black water. When I tried to surface, I realized I was trapped underneath a floating dock. Panic surged as I fumbled in the dark, eventually finding a small gap where I could gasp for air. I managed to pull myself to the edge of the dock and looked up to face my attacker. There stood a large crane. It was still slowly spreading its wings in a threat display, emitting a shrill, piercing noise. It must have been sleeping on a post between the boats, and its elevated position made it look far larger and more human than it actually was. As the adrenaline finally bled out of my system, I hauled myself onto the wood and threw up into the water. I have never experienced that kind of primal terror, first from the initial jump scare, and then from the suffocating realization that I was trapped beneath the docks in the dark. I used to live on the 5th floor of a building located right at a busy intersection. Directly across the street from me were several large dumpsters where everyone on our side of the block tossed their trash. I mentioned that because it might have been the root of the problem. One spring night, I was pulling an all-nighter, sitting at my computer right by the open windows. Around 5 a.m., I started hearing a strange, faint buzzing. At first, I wrote it off as a hallucination brought on by a lack of sleep and a bit too much sugar. As the minutes crawled by, however, the buzzing grew louder and noticeably angrier. Suddenly, a blur of black and yellow zipped right in front of my face. I didn't want to believe it was real, but I finally focused on the sound and realized it was coming from the windows. I pulled back the curtains and saw that the other side of my somewhat ragged bug screens was covered in a massive swarm of wasps. Not bees, wasps. A terrifying amount of them, all crawling on the mesh and the glass, seemingly trying to find a way in. I'm fairly certain my screaming woke the neighbors, despite the thick cement or brick walls typically found in Armenian construction. I grabbed my laptop, bolted to the bedroom, and locked myself inside until late that afternoon. By the time I finally emerged, they were gone. It turns out that for some bizarre reason, likely tied to those nearby dumpsters, the wasps would gather at my windows early every morning and disappear by noon. Needless to say, I didn't feel safe opening my windows again until we finally replaced the screens. Looking back, I probably wouldn't have been so traumatized if it weren't for a different, slightly more interesting encounter I'd had previously, but honestly, this swarm was way scarier to me. Wasps, man. Never again. When I was a junior in high school, I was home alone one day when the doorbell rang. I didn't think twice about it. I looked out the window and saw a man I'd known since I was 7, a neighbor whose daughters I was friends with. I opened the door to tell him my parents weren't home and offered to take a message, but at that exact moment, my mom burst through the garage door. She threw her entire weight against the front door, desperately trying to shove it shut. I stood back in total shock as the man kicked our front door in, then turned and calmly stalked back down the street toward his own house a few doors away. My mom later explained that he was furious over a decision she had made as the HOA president. Just minutes earlier, he had aggressively cut her off in traffic while my 2 infant siblings were in the back seat. We called the police, but they actually talked us out of filing for a restraining order, arguing that it was just a piece of paper that wouldn't truly stop him if he decided to escalate. For the next month or two, he went out of his way to terrorize our family. He would find my stepdad at the neighborhood tennis courts and get in his face, threatening him in front of everyone. On his way back, he would stop and pace in front of our house for 15 minutes at a time, always under the cover of night. The harassment took a heavy toll on my mother, who became understandably paranoid. She often heard the front door open and then click shut a few minutes later when she was supposed to be alone. Given his behavior, I wouldn't put it past him to have been entering the house just to mess with her head. Eventually, the obsession faded, and we don't really speak about it anymore. However, that experience left a lasting mark. It's the reason I'll always keep something for self-defense, like a baseball bat, in my own home. When I was 8 years old, I was at home with my dad while he was on the phone with his pharmacist. I was sitting nearby, pretending to do my homework, while he discussed a new medication he'd been prescribed. Because of his health, he had to visit the VA hospital weekly for monitoring, and he was explaining to the pharmacist that he felt he needed to switch back to a previous prescription. The next thing I heard was a loud, heavy thud. I looked up to see my father lying on the floor. Initially, I thought he was playing a prank. He was the kind of dad who thought scaring me was hilarious. At 8 years old, having never lost anyone close to me, I couldn't rationalize the gravity of the situation. I likely would have sat there in a mounting panic for 5 minutes if it hadn't been for a voice calling out from the phone receiver. I picked up the phone, and the pharmacist asked what had happened. When I told him my dad was on the floor and wasn't moving, he told me to go sit on the porch and promised that help was on the way. Despite a fire station being located just down the street, it took nearly 15 minutes for anyone to arrive. When the police finally showed up, they took me to a neighbor's house over my protests. A frantic search began for my mother, who had just started a new nursing job. Since my parents were separated, I didn't have her work information or a way to reach my stepfather. I only knew she worked at the hospital. Eventually, they tracked her down, and she came to get me. My father had suffered a massive heart attack. We were later told that even if he had been in a hospital surrounded by the world's best medical team, the attack was so sudden and severe that he likely wouldn't have survived. Even though I was only 8 and had only lived with him for a few months, I still miss him deeply, though my memories of him are beginning to fade. That day left me with lasting scars. I struggle with PTSD, severe depression, and a paralyzing anxiety surrounding death that often makes sleep impossible. I also carry a profound distrust of emergency responders. I remember the agony of waiting 10 minutes for a firefighter to arrive from a station just blocks away, and the sight of half a dozen police officers eventually showing up only to stand outside laughing and chatting as if nothing was wrong. I've seen counselors on and off for years to process what I witnessed that day, but the trauma of that morning stays with me. When my daughter was 6 months old, she suffered a series of seizures and suddenly stopped breathing. As a first-time mother, I was paralyzed by the sheer terror of not knowing what was happening or how to save her. As her skin began to turn blue, I started screaming, a raw, guttural sound that didn't even feel like my own voice. My boyfriend at the time was in the next room, confused by the sudden chaos, but he took my word for the urgency and called 911. I remember her eyes rolling back and a small, haunting grimace on her face that almost looked like a faint smile. I tried gently shaking her, desperate for any kind of response, while the air around me filled with my own frantic cries of, "Oh my God, my baby is dying." By the time the ambulance arrived, she had started breathing again, though she remained terrifyingly lethargic. It was eventually discovered that she had pneumonia, which had severely compromised her breathing, but I wouldn't get that diagnosis for another 2 weeks. The first hospital we went to treated me with immediate suspicion rather than support, because I had been in a psychiatric ward for self-harm a few months prior. They accused me of fabricating the entire episode. They held my daughter for nearly a week without providing any treatment, despite an X-ray technician having already flagged signs of pneumonia in her lungs. The moment they finally released her to my care, I didn't go home. I took her straight to a different hospital to get her the help she actually needed. I was home alone when I received some devastating news via email, triggering a severe panic attack that rapidly escalated into full-body muscle spasms and seizures. For nearly an hour, my stomach convulsed so violently that I was gagging or vomiting every 60 seconds. The physical toll was so intense that I genuinely believed I was dying. I remained in that state until my sister finally arrived home. She immediately contacted my father and called for an ambulance. Thankfully, the paramedics were able to stabilize me and get me the help I needed. When I was 14, I had a terrifyingly severe allergic reaction to a medication administered after my knee surgery. It started with a pins and needles sensation and rapid swelling in my face, which quickly began to spread across my entire body. The physical effects were overwhelming. My tongue and throat swelled so much that breathing became a struggle, and my hearing muffled until I could barely perceive sound. While I didn't completely lose consciousness, I blacked out visually, remaining trapped in a state where I was aware of the chaos around me, but couldn't see a thing. The entire allergy team at the children's hospital gathered just outside my door, debating their next move. My condition was so unstable that they were afraid to even move me to the ICU, fearing the transition might make the reaction worse. After about 15 minutes of pure panic, the symptoms finally began to fade, only for the entire ordeal to repeat itself an hour or two later. To this day, I still don't know exactly what triggered such a violent reaction. When I was about 14, my sister moved out of the room we shared, leaving me alone in a space that began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. In one corner of the room, I had a mesh net hanging near the ceiling to hold all my teddy bears. One night, I woke up drenched in sweat from a disturbing dream, only to hear the distinct sound of someone laughing. When I looked up toward the net, I saw a figure with hollow, glowing white eyes and a top hat, sitting there swinging its legs. It began to mock me, relentlessly telling me how worthless I was. Eventually, I found the courage to bolt from the room and run toward my parents' bedroom. The entity followed me the entire way, laughing the whole time. Despite my frantic screaming, my parents wouldn't wake up. I spent the rest of the night collapsed in the corner of their room, crying while the figure continued its cruel taunting. This happened a few more times, but that first night was by far the worst. I eventually tore down the net and got rid of every single teddy bear I owned. I haven't kept one in my house since. This story just popped into my head. It's probably not as intense as some of the others here, but it definitely left a mark. When I was about 10 or 11, there were 5 of us just hanging out and walking down the street. One of my friends decided it would be a great idea to throw some pebbles at a specific house because of some minor grudge. We tossed them and immediately bolted, sprinting to the next street about 200 meters away. We were leaning over, gasping for breath and cracking up, thinking the whole thing was hilarious. Suddenly, my sixth sense kicked in. I felt a massive shift in the energy around us, a heavy, powerful, angry aura. I turned around and saw a guy who looked like a 20-year-old bodybuilder about 150 meters back, sprinting toward us at full speed. I froze for a second before turning to my friends, who were still completely oblivious. I yelled, "Run! He's coming after us." They saw him, hit that same moment of stunned silence, and then we all scattered. We split into two groups. Two of my friends headed toward the street that led to our houses, but my group of three ended up forced in the opposite direction toward a local park. Unfortunately, our pursuer was fueled by pure rage and decided to single us out. I knew the layout of the park well enough to know there were two different street exits. We tried to play it smart, waiting at one of the exits to see which way he would turn. Once we saw his choice, we doubled back toward the other exit. But he was playing mind games too. He suddenly pivoted and headed back our way. We barely had time to dive into a thick bush to hide. Luckily, the park was hilly, and we were perched at the top while he was searching the bottom. We could see his every move. Once he finally walked past our hiding spot, we scrambled out and took the longest possible route home. After that day, we never set foot on that street again, even though it meant a much longer walk to school every morning. We eventually saw the funny side of it, but we definitely learned our lesson about throwing stones. I have two stories that still stick with me. The first happened when I was 10 years old. We were traveling down a quiet back road, heading home from a soccer game, when we looked up through the sunroof and saw something incredible. It looked like a massive black plane flying at an impossibly low altitude. It seemed to be hovering just above the treetops. What made it truly eerie was the silence. Even after we turned the radio off, we couldn't hear an engine or any sound at all. After what felt like an hour, though it was likely only a few seconds, it simply vanished. We weren't anywhere near an airfield or a landing strip, so I still have no idea what it actually was. The other experience involves my great-grandparents' house. During sleepovers there, I once had a terrifying dream about a witch-like woman beckoning me toward her. When I woke up and told my family about it, I was shocked to find out that almost all of my relatives had experienced the exact same thing. My aunts, uncles, and even my mom had all seen the same woman in their dreams while staying in that house. When I was younger, I was right in the middle of a massive neighborhood super soaker fight. The family down the street was having a big reunion with relatives who had flown in from the south, and everyone was getting involved. One guy was being pretty aggressive, spraying kids directly in the face with a high-pressure hose, so I decided to take him down a notch. I snuck up on him and got him right in the face with my water gun. At the time, it felt like fair play. The situation turned dark instantly. He chased me into my friend's garage and pinned my head down against a row of cardboard boxes stacked next to a pop-up camper. He grabbed a crowbar and swung it at my head with everything he had. He missed by inches, leaving a massive dent in the camper instead. My neighbor from across the street saw the whole thing and started screaming. The guy eventually retreated to his house, and we called the police. For some reason, and to this day, I have no idea why, my parents didn't end up pressing charges. Looking back, the fact that he walked away from that is still baffling to me. During my wife's first pregnancy, the labor was an absolute nightmare. It was 38 hours of hell that began with 2 failed epidurals. At one point, our daughter had progressed far enough that we could see the top of her head, but then everything just stopped. An emergency C-section was ordered. As they prepared to give my wife a spinal block, I was sent to an adjacent room to change into scrubs so I could be with her in the OR. About 10 minutes later, a nurse rushed in with terrifying news. my wife could still feel the initial incision. They had to put her under general anesthesia immediately, which meant I was no longer allowed in the room. 5 minutes passed in a blur before I heard the words that will haunt me for the rest of my life echoing through the halls. Code blue. Code blue. Code blue. My mother had worked in a hospital for 30 years, so I knew exactly what that meant. Someone had stopped breathing. At first, I tried to tell myself it was for another ward, but my heart shattered when I heard footsteps slamming down the hallway past my door. I knew then that one, or both, of them might be dying. I don't remember exactly what I said or did when I finally stumbled out of that room. All I remember is the face of the first nurse I saw. Whatever she saw in my expression shook her to her core. She didn't say a word. She just led me back into the room and held me while I started screaming. Initially, they couldn't even tell me who was in trouble. Finally, an nurse emerged to tell me it was my daughter. She wasn't breathing, but they were working on her. I collapsed to the floor in tears. The worst-case scenarios played on a loop in my head. Asterisk, how do I tell my wife she's gone? What if she's brain dead? Asterisk. An hour later, my wife was wheeled into recovery without our daughter. A neonatal surgeon explained that she was alive, but it was too soon to know if there was brain damage. We had to wait for her oxygen levels to stabilize. I spent the next several hours alone, waiting in agony, trying to explain the situation to my wife through the haze of her anesthesia while she struggled to comprehend. For hours later, we finally got the update from the NICU. She was fine. Her blood had stayed oxygenated through the umbilical cord, and doctors believe the anesthesia had simply crossed over and knocked her out. The moment they intubated her, she snapped out of it. After a week of monitoring in the ICU, our daughter finally came home. She just started kindergarten 2 weeks ago. I truly thought I was about to watch my second grandmother die in the span of a single day. We had just finished the funeral service for my maternal grandmother and were gathered nearby, eating cake and sharing stories to celebrate her life. One of her oldest friends was in the middle of a speech, reminiscing about the day they first met, when I noticed something was wrong with my paternal grandmother. She was sitting there with her mouth wide open, unable to speak properly. An ambulance was called immediately, but the wait felt like an eternity. I was paralyzed by the fear that I was going to lose both of my grandmothers on the exact same day. It felt too cruel to be real. Fortunately, it turned out to be a sharp fluctuation in her blood pressure. The paramedics mentioned that they had actually seen several similar cases that day for some reason. She recovered quickly and, in true grandmother fashion, was laughing about the whole ordeal just a few minutes after her vitals returned to normal. She is doing fine now, but that moment of uncertainty was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. When my son was not yet 2 years old, he began choking on a metal washer. At the time, I had no idea what the object was. I just knew something was terribly wrong when my husband came running toward me, clutching our son under his arms and shouting that he couldn't breathe. I told my husband to get our other small children into the car and call 911 immediately. I looked into my son's throat but couldn't see a thing, and his face was already starting to turn white. I began delivering back blows, and if you are ever in that situation, you realize quickly that you cannot be gentle. I moved on to abdominal thrusts, but still, nothing happened. A wave of cold dread washed over me. I scooped him up with my left arm, holding him almost completely head down, and headed for the door while continuing to strike him firmly between the shoulder blades. My husband already had the other kids in the back and the engine running, phone in hand. Just as I stepped over the threshold of our house, I heard a distinct clink as a metal washer hit the stones. My son let out a sharp gasp and began to cry. It was the most beautiful sound I've ever heard. The entire ordeal likely lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime of pure terror. He's 14 now and a terrific kid, and I am still so incredibly grateful to my college first aid instructor. He was a high-ranking hazardous materials firefighter in Denver at the time, and he made us practice the protocol for a choking child over and over again. I truly believe that course saved my son's life. During my high school years, I worked at a local coffee shop. One evening, just as we were preparing to close, a woman rushed to the counter with a frantic look in her eyes. She told us, breathless, that someone was following her. Without hesitation, we ushered her into the back office and gave her a phone to call the police. Just as the office door clicked shut, a disheveled-looking man walked through the front entrance. He stood in the center of the empty shop, his eyes scanning the room for a minute or so. When he didn't see her, he turned around and walked back out into the night. It was a stark reminder: never be afraid to ask for help when you're in trouble. While shopping at the grocery store, I noticed a man in a heavy jacket following me through every aisle. It was over 100 degrees outside, and his choice of clothing was as bizarre as his persistence. By the time I reached the checkout, he had vanished, and I dismissed the encounter as a strange coincidence. Before heading to a beach without public facilities, I made a quick stop at the store's restroom. I settled into the first of 3 stalls. Moments later, the restroom door creaked open. Through the half-inch gap between the door and the partition, I saw a familiar flash of fabric, the heavy jacket. My heart stopped. I heard his footsteps pass my stall, pause, and then retreat. Then, the man pressed his face to the gap. I looked up for only a split second before the horror of the situation set in. Paralyzed by fear and humiliation, I stared at the floor, feeling the weight of his gaze on me for 20 agonizing seconds. Finally, I heard him pull away and exit the room. I was shaking so violently I could barely compose myself. Abandoning my grocery bags and skipping the sink, I bolted for my car, my hands trembling all the way home. To this day, I am haunted by fury. I replay the moment over and over, wondering why I froze instead of fighting back. I wish I had confronted him, clawed at his eyes, or at least alerted the store staff instead of running away in shame. It wasn't just the invasion of privacy that stayed with me. It was the lingering anger at my own silence. My middle child, my oldest son, was about 3 years old when he and I were home alone one day. His older sister was at school, and his mother was out running errands. At the time, I was working the 3rd shift and living in a state of constant sleep deprivation. I waited for him to tire out, and eventually, he started twirling his hair, his telltale sign that he was ready for a nap. We settled onto the couch with him curled up on my chest, and as he drifted off, so did I. I woke up a few hours later to find my chest empty. Usually, he would wake me up by poking at my eyes, but this time it was silent. I listened intently, but the house was still. I got up, expecting to catch him in the middle of some toddler mischief, but he was nowhere to be found. He wasn't in the house at all. This was especially terrifying because we live on a very rural farm. If he had managed to get outside, the possibilities were grim. I ran out into the yard, my mind immediately racing toward the pond, the wells, and the horses. I spent the next hour screaming his name and crying as I searched the property, consumed by a level of uncontrollable terror that I never want to experience again. Then, the most incredible relief washed over me. My wife's car pulled into the driveway. I ran toward her, completely distraught, only to see my son sitting safely in his car seat in the back. The moments that followed are a blur. I practically collapsed on the spot. It turns out she had come home earlier, found us both sound asleep, and decided to gently pick him up and take him with her so I could get some much-needed rest. She just hadn't thought to leave a note. Tornadoes have always terrified me, and for good reason. When I was a kid, one ripped through my town and killed several people, so I never take it lightly when the sirens start blaring. Despite that history, I somehow ended up buying a house without a basement. Now, whenever a warning hits, I just cower in the bathroom until the danger passes. A few weeks ago, a storm seemingly materialized out of nowhere while I was driving home. We had been under watches all day, but the severe weather wasn't supposed to arrive until much later, so I was completely caught off guard. One minute the sky looked normal, the next it turned a haunting shade of green, and the clouds began to churn in a way I'd never witnessed. Then the sirens started. To my horror, I could see a funnel forming, not on the ground yet, thank God, directly to the east of me over an open field. I was fortunately near a Walgreens, so I pulled in to take cover with a group of strangers. The staff was incredibly kind, and I was so grateful for their help, especially since seeing that cloud had me on the verge of a total breakdown. The most absurd part of the whole ordeal: to get into the Walgreens parking lot, I had to make a left turn, but I hit a red light. I sat there at the intersection, paralyzed with fear and staring at the funnel cloud, waiting patiently for the green arrow. Looking back, I can't help but wonder what was wrong with me. In the middle of a life-threatening emergency, I was still worried about following traffic laws.